in terms of connecting the fascia back to some of the traditional theories, is we do have this idea of internal-external relationships, and the way that the meridians are an external phenomena that relate to the internal structures being the organs, right? So there's the internal-external connections between the yin-yang meridians, like the lung and large intestine and pericardium and sanjiao, right? But then there's the anatomy of this as well. And when we start to look at the connective tissues and the way that the fascia connects these organ systems, it starts to line up with a lot of those traditional theories.
I'm Michael Max, and this is Neurological, the podcast that curates East Asian medicine and methods through the power of conversation. There's that bit in Nanjing 61 about the 4 levels of doctors. You know which one I'm talking about. The one that goes, anyone who looks and knows it is to be called spirit. Anyone who listens and knows it is to be called a sage. Those who ask and know it, those are to be called artisans. And anyone who feels the vessels and knows it, well, that's a skilled workman. Interestingly enough, I like being a skilled workman. Usually, when I hear people refer to these distinctions, there's a tacit agreement that we should be aiming for the spirit level practitioner, the one who can look and know, probably craft a treatment with a few well-curated herbs, a single surprising needle, or maybe just a few well-chosen words. In the everyday world of human status and belonging, you want to be aiming at that top spot of whatever game it is that you've decided is worth playing. Perhaps it's a lack of motivation on my part, or maybe just the recognition that I don't have the wiring for that kind of voltage. Maybe it's that I like to tinker, put my hands on things to get a sense of their measure and character. That's why it's hard for me to buy clothes off the internet, because the way the fabric feels is the most essential quality for me. I like to put my hands on people. It's not something most of us do in everyday life. It's a kind of communion, the most ancient way we have of communicating. It's intimate without being sexual. There's so many filters and blockages that I've learned to put up over the years to what might be communicated by touch and attending to the vessels. I feel like I need to start there. Start with listening respectfully and attentively to the vessels. It's a good place to start because it's rarely where doctors start. In our modern world, we love to explore the emotions. They're given a higher priority and status. Our old books tell us that people can fall ill due to the internal climate of emotions. I don't disagree. I'm fascinated by models of psychological development and think they absolutely need to be brought more into play in skillful ways. Personality models like the Myers-Briggs and the Big Five, they're useful mappings of the internal landscape. They're reliable tools for navigating in that domain. But there is something about putting my hands on people and not thinking. Something about sensing without storytelling, attending without seeking. It somehow helps me to get on more friendly terms with uncertainty. There is something in how it requires me to pause so I can observe what else is present beyond cognition. I'd go so far as to say it's a moment of non-doing that perhaps can inform the doing. I've always appreciated the skilled workman who can consistently cut a board to the intended measure, the cook who tastes her way into spicing a stew, the mechanic who understands structures and moving parts, so squeaks and rattles reveal the condition of the worn-out parts. There is something about a skilled workman that appeals to me. In the Tansai of Jingqi Shen, of Heaven, Earth, Human, the skilled workmen, they lean more into the Jing, the earth, the essence. Here on the mud ball of earth, it's those with skill and know-how that get things done. because they understand the workings of Earth. And the workings of Earth, well, it's the 10,000 things. So it's complicated. It's full of trouble and woe and contradiction. It's not a bad place to start if you're looking to help with the suffering that comes with being that which is between heaven and earth. I've always admired people who are good with their hands, the ones who can build things with both function and beauty, the people who are able to see where something needs repair and apply it with a deft hand. In Chinese, Ling Chao means deft, skilled, or proficient. The Ling of Ling Chao, that translates as clever or sharp, as well as spirit. And Chao, that means skillful or artful. This is certainly something to aim at as a practitioner. One of the things I've come to appreciate about the old East Asian medicine is that it tends to dissolve the neat lines between the boxes of this and that without turning the complexity of the whole into an undifferentiated mush. In this conversation with James Spears, we explore the connections in the body that help us to understand how a distal point is connected to structures seemingly far, far away. We'll investigate how the Tung system overlaps to some degree on the traditional meridians, but if you grasp its unique maps, you'll see another terrain of physiology and function. As Volker Scheid said in a recent conversation, there are many ways to practice the true Chinese medicine. We'll get into this meaty conversation with James Spears on Tung-style acupuncture and the fascia right after a few messages from our sponsors who have some solutions to your clinical challenges. These conversations come to you through the generous support of our sponsors and members. Blue Poppy, your new one-stop shop, has speedy shipping options on everything that you need for your clinic. It's Women's Health Month at Mayway Herbs. Check out their new website for learning resources on helping women with herbal medicine. Are you a creature of habit? How about making a change that helps your patients and the planet with AccuFast needles? And later in the show, raising your fees doesn't have to be a difficult process. Jane has helpful suggestions on making it easy and effective. And finally, have you considered that having a thriving, profitable practice is one of the most healing things that you can do? Julie Bear Don't Walk has, and she can help you do something about it too. Do be sure to visit the sponsors page on the Qiological website to take advantage of all the special offers our terrific sponsors have for listeners of the podcast. Picture this. Your clinic is buzzing with patients, and then you realize that you're down to your last box of needles. No need for panic, because Blue Poppy, your one-stop shop for all your acupuncture needs, they ship orders received before 3 p.m. on the same day. With a quick visit to Blue Poppy's website, you can order premium needles, herbal formulas, and that special Dr. Bob's oil that your patients love. Blue Poppy understands practitioners can't keep patients waiting. That's why they strive to get you what you need when you need it. From high-quality Chinese herbs and formulations to acupuncture supplies and clinical essentials, Blue Poppy has served practitioners for nearly 40 years with products that meet the highest of standards. Discover everything Blue Poppy has to offer by visiting www.bluepoppy.com, and don't forget to subscribe to their mailing list for exclusive offers and more.
Hi folks, I'm Yvonne Lau, president of Mayway Herbs. May is Women's Health Month, and as a women-owned and women-run business, we especially love how Chinese medicine can support wellness through every stage of a woman's life. So in this month's newsletter and podcast, we're covering topics like PMS, pregnancy, menopause, and osteoporosis. We'll share expert insights and effective treatment strategies you can put to good use in your clinic. Our Plumflower brand line includes herbal tea pills, tablets, extract granules, and organic herbs, all of which you can find on Mayway.com. And where you can also find articles, videos, and other resources to support your practice. Since 1969, Mayway has been a trusted source for high-quality herbal products. In these challenging times, please know that we remain committed to keeping our products accessible and affordable so you can take care of yourself and your patients. As always, thank you for supporting Real Chinese Medicine.
Daily habits and routines feel comforting, familiar, easy, automatic. That's the power of repetition. You've worked out the kinks and can do it with your eyes closed. But what if you shook things up? What if you ditched the old routine and tried something new? Hi, I'm John Sten. I've practiced acupuncture for over 30 years, and together with my wife Kelly, we created the world's first eco-friendly acupuncture needle. The AcuFast earth-friendly needle system cuts your packaging waste by 60 to 90%, depending upon your needle type, speeds up your needling, gives you more control, and best of all, while you're healing patients, we plant a tree for every 2 boxes your clinic uses. Thousands of acupuncturists have already made the switch. In just the last year, they've helped plant over 16,000 trees. Since we started, that number has grown to over 50,000. So break the routine. Be the change. Visit acufastneedles.com. Your patients and the planet will thank you.
James Spears, welcome to Geological.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I'm glad to have you here. Through the magic of the internet, I can be in St. Louis, Missouri. You can be in Vietnam. We can have a conversation about acupuncture. We live in the most amazing time.
Live and in style.
I know. It's cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm really looking forward to talking to you today because I know we're going to get into talking about Tung, tongue acupuncture, as we say in English, and fascia.
Yes.
I'm very excited about this. But before we get into all of it, I'm always curious to know how people found their way into the world of acupuncture, especially people that aren't young, especially people with a little gray in their hair. Like, we didn't grow up with this stuff.
Yeah. Well, I got into it fairly young. I was going to go to medical school out of college and had prepared for that. So I was on that path, and it was my last semester, second to last semester. I had everything prepared to go to Western Medical School. And then I took a seminar-style class where they had different therapists and healers and doctors come in. And that was my first exposure to acupuncture. It really blew open my perception of what was available and what was out there. And I had been doing the Taoist meditations and the Mantek Chia meditations and had learned some of those things from someone that was quite well experienced as an anthropologist who had traveled the world and introduced me to martial arts and meditation. And that played some role, I think, in guiding me that route. And I was just really not into what I saw the pharmaceutical companies doing and the way that had affected family members. And I think that started to enter the public conversation around that time more, that some of the harm of the pharmaceuticals and how doctors were largely using them. And it's not that I'm against Western medicine. I want to establish that clearly because I've always taken an integrative approach. And I meet some people that are really against certain things, and understandably so. But I've always been an integrative type person that wants to understand the best of both the East and Western traditions. But in looking at the options that were available outside of traditional medical education, I chose Chinese medicine over other options like osteopathy and chiropractics and naturopath because I felt like the needles could potentially replace the scalpel in a lot of situations, and then that the herbs could be replacements for drugs and medication. So,
yeah. How have you seen the needle be a substitute for the scalpel?
Well, if you've been in practice for any time, you see patients come in and they're saying that their doctors are recommending surgeries for various conditions and they want to see what their options are and give acupuncture a try. And, I can say that I've helped countless people with surgery. So we left off where you asked about how the needles could replace a scalpel.
Yeah. So, yeah, you were saying that often our patients come in, doctors are recommending surgery. I often hear patients say things like, well, my knees, they're bone on bone.
Yeah, right. Yeah, common. And the doctor's saying the surgery is the only option. but I want to see what else is available. Like, I think if you've been in practice for any number of years, you'll have heard that very frequently. So I think it's some level. I interviewed a medical doctor. I was deciding what path to take. And he was a doctor that I was considering like studying with and getting a referral from, because it's going Western medical school route. You need to have referral.
That's a really smart idea, to do a little informational interviewing.
Yeah. So,
kind of look around the corner of where you're headed.
exactly. So one guy that I found in my area, he was a medical doctor, but then at the time he was only practicing acupuncture. And so I spoke with him, I interviewed him, got to know him a bit.
Wait a minute. A medical doctor who was only practicing acupuncture.
Yeah.
That's an interesting guy.
Yeah, definitely. And like speaking with him was very influential in sending me that direction into acupuncture. And I think he's probably the one that put that in my head, because I do remember, like, even before going to acupuncture school, that I was thinking that way, that the needles could replace the scalpel in a certain situation. So, and I like the historical roots of it. I like that there's a tradition of, movement therapies and Tai Chi and Qigong and meditation and the mind-body connection. So it was a culmination of all of those factors, and just where I was at personally at that time felt like that.
Yeah. Isn't it funny how these things happen?
Yeah.
We're headed down a certain path. Something's got our attention. And then it's like, I mean, in your case, meditation and Qigong and some things, right? You're kind of primed in a way.
Certainly.
For another option to show up.
Yeah. And I think it was those things, and having a couple of years of experience with meditation and Qigong, that, as you said, it primed me for going that other route. If that wasn't there, I probably never would have done that.
Yeah. I'm thinking about surgeons. I've got a nephew who's a cardiothoracic surgeon.
Mm-hmm.
It's his idea of a good time. He's a really interesting kid. And one of the things that surgeons are also very attentive to are the fascial planes.
Oh, yeah.
They have to be super attentive to that, because it's, because they kind of have to wind their way through the body.
Uh-huh. So you think they're more aware of it these days?
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
What little I understand is that it's one of the things that they pay attention to. So what got your attention? How did the fascia get your attention? What started that inquiry?
I was always interested in movement therapies, and I had been a long-term practitioner of yoga. And I came into yoga through more of a meditative path and learning yogic meditations years before I started practicing asana practice and doing the stretches and the hatha yoga. So it gave me a unique perspective on yoga, coming in from meditation first rather than asana practice. And the thing that really opened me up to it was I took a yoga retreat. I did a 5-day yoga retreat that a friend of mine invited me to. And he was this great guy. He was in his 70s and traveling the world and doing yoga teacher trainings and teaching everywhere. And he looked like he was 50, but he was 70. And that had been his lifelong career, an Australian guy. And so he invited me to one of his yoga retreats for 5 days. And I went to that. He showed some pictures of fascial planes from Tom Myers. And that's where some of the light bulbs start going off. Like, it's easy to make the connection with the meridians. And I would caution any acupuncturist out there to not overlook that, like I did for a couple of years. I saw the fascial planes and I recognized them as looking very similar to the meridians. But then, like, I just kind of disregarded that and kind of had the attitude of, well, oh yeah, I already know that. It looks like the meridians. But it sat in my mind for some time, and things were kind of rolling over. And then when I really started taking it seriously and learning the anatomy and really digging into that and digging into structural factors and speaking with osteopath friends about things and the way that they approach things, then some of the lights started going off. But also, integrating it with the Tung style, it was asking those questions of why do these points work sometimes and sometimes not, and really trying to identify the best group of points to use for each client. And it was the fascial lines that filled in those gaps that couldn't gather from the traditional knowledge, no matter how long I studied it. Or
That is a question I think all of us face every time we go into clinic. Like, how is it that a certain set of points for one patient works so well, and you get somebody else and they're seemingly very similar,
yeah,
but it doesn't work for them?
yeah, that was the
I mean, this is, for me, like one of the really cool things and fun things about practicing, because it really keeps you on your toes, but it's also the really annoying thing about practicing because, well, I thought I understood this, but obviously I'm missing something.
Yeah. I remember going through times of practice where I was on a roll and it seemed like I was getting everyone better. And I seem to go through these phases sometimes, and then I get overly confident or whatever, something happens. And then you go into this phase where people aren't responding, or those groups of points that work so well for so many clients don't work. And it was that question, why do these groups of points work for some and not others? And yet the other groups of points will work for them. It was those questions that really were very fundamental to me digging into Tom Myers' book, Anatomy Trains, and understanding how really it's just mechanical energy and understanding mechanical energy, understanding chi from that perspective.
Wait, you're taking the magic out of it. Or wait a minute, maybe you're putting the magic back in it. Tell me more about the mechanical understandings.
Well, okay, so we speak of chi, right? And I have always enjoyed, and this is one thing that attracted me to Asian medicine, was the mystical side of it and the magical side of it and the spiritual side of it. That was something that really drove me into it as much as anything. And at the same time, like entering into practice and into professional relationships with other kinds of doctors, chiropractors, or if you're seeking referrals from medical doctors, I learned very quickly that like they don't really take to our terminology so well.
Not at all. I mean, it's very off-putting.
Yeah, exactly.
When you've got a materialistic view of the world. I'm not saying it's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for sure, if you've got a surgeon who is doing stuff that surgery is really helpful for, you want them to really understand that material stuff really, really, really well.
Absolutely. Completely.
But there's more.
Yeah. The magic still does exist, but it's a different way to think about things. And yet, because I'm an integrative person and I like to learn from both the East and the West, we have this thing called chi, and it translates as energy, right? And if we look at the different forms of energy that exist in Western science, there's electromagnetic energy, there's chemical energy, which relates to biochemistry and biochemical bonds, and ATP, and the production of energy from the food and the oxygen, right? And even in the symbol for chi, it contains the radical for air, vapor, and rice. So there's this recognition of chi coming from food or rice and air or vapor, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like that's, if we break that down and we want to look at it from a Western perspective, that's biochemical energy. That's the way that the food is broken down and the production of energy and ATP, and we can go into the biochemistry and the mitochondria and all of that. Okay, but we're not going to do that. We're going to look more at the mechanical energy, because mechanical energy is energy and movement. Okay, so anything that's moving, then we can speak of that in terms of mechanical energy. And then there's electromagnetic energy or electrical energy. So the nervous system and much of the body, it also depends on and runs on electrical energy. And then the musculoskeletal system is a system that works through mechanical energy. So I think it's really helpful to think of this, because it does answer a lot of the fundamental questions and fill in a lot of the gaps that acupuncturists have if we just start to think of chi not in this sort of loosely defined mystical thing that we can't really put our hands on because it's intangible, right? But if we bring this to the anatomy and the musculoskeletal system and understand mechanical energy, then it starts to answer all of those fundamental questions, or maybe not all of them, but a lot of those fundamental questions that acupuncturists ask themselves about why does this group of points work, but this one doesn't for this particular client. Why do the Thigh 9 Miles 3 work so well sometimes, but for other people they don't? And so that's what I've been sharing and teaching for the last 4 years since I've written and published a lot of material.
For me, this is very satisfying, thinking about how qi can manifest in different ways and at different levels. As acupuncturists, we all have the idea that everything is qi, which on one sense, well, that's kind of cool and groovy because it's mystical. And at least for me, in another sense, it's highly unsatisfying.
Right.
Because I've grown up in the West, I have a pretty analytical mind. I want to know how things work.
Yeah.
I get it that different things work at different levels, like biochemical's different than mechanical, right? And that's different than, say, hormonal.
Yeah.
Right? Or ATP and mitochondria and all that. I mean, it's like qi behaves differently as it inhabits different structures.
Yeah. We speak of these different types of qi in traditional medicine. And, there's a beauty to that. Like, I really love the traditional way of speaking about things and describing things. And it's pure poetry. And a lot of times it works, but also when I came out of school, I was quite disappointed to see that TCM and what I learned in school, it wasn't that effective in a lot of cases. And I learned in school that it could treat all these things. And then you come out of school and you learn that it's not as effective as what maybe you were taught it was.
I would go so far as to say it didn't deliver on the promise.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And I'd also go so far as to say, in some ways, we have almost an evangelical kind of thinking because we're working with energy, because we work with the spirit. Well, golly, we can treat anything.
Yeah.
Well, and then you get out and you find out, wait a minute, it's not delivering.
Yeah. I had someone from Beijing purchase one of my classes last month, and he purchased it. And then a week later, he wrote me back and he said he wanted to learn more. I guess he just went through the first class rather quickly. And he said he was already starting to implement it into practice. And the thing that caught me that he said, though, was that he said that he wanted to learn some new things because what he learned in school, it wasn't working. And he was disappointed in TCM. And this is a guy that was educated in Beijing and, probably came out of a 6-year program there. And he's asking those same things. Why isn't this working like they taught me in school?
Yeah.
And then he reported that he tried some of the things I was teaching and he was getting better results. So then he wanted to sign up for more. So
it seems to me that our education, and this is a little weird about acupuncture education, because most educations, you go to school, you learn something, you really get a set of skills.
Yeah, right.
That you can go use.
Yeah.
Pretty quickly. And it seems to me with an acupuncture education, we get a learner's permit after 6 years.
Good way to put it.
I mean, there's some things we can do, and certainly there's a perspective that we have. But to learn how to drive that dang thing, that's a different thing altogether.
Absolutely. Completely.
So for the folks listening, share with us some of the ways that we can mechanically drive this thing that will help us to be helpful to people.
You're asking that to me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good question. Well, a lot of this really comes down to, I think the best place to start that conversation at is understanding that there are structural dynamics that play a role in disease processes. And that's not only occurring in the musculoskeletal system, but that's the easiest place to start. But structural factors will also play out in internal disharmonies as well. And the osteopaths, I've been fortunate enough to work around a lot of European osteopaths and English osteopaths, being here in Asia, because there's a lot of European people here that come here. And so they really helped to open the doors of perception for me in terms of how important structure is. And when we're speaking about the musculoskeletal system, then structure and alignment of the body is a really fundamental thing in health. And for most of the things that we treat as acupuncturists, or a lot of us, we see a lot of musculoskeletal system conditions, right? Low back pain, neck problems, common types of things that we see a lot of and that people come to us for. So understanding the structural dynamics and just some really simple things. Like, for instance, a really common pattern that you see is an external rotation in people's feet that can be related to low back pain or knee pain or hip pain. And it's a structural thing. Like, your feet should line up. I'll just demonstrate with my hands, but if your foot or your tibia or your femur is externally rotated and pointing out, that's a structural imbalance that is going to lead to foot problems, ankle problems, knee problems, hip problems, low back pain. It can even end up here in the shoulder and be related to headaches or neck pain. And most acupuncturists don't understand these things, and they're really quite easy to understand.
And it's right there on the table in front of you. They lay down, you look at their feet.
Yeah, exactly.
It tells a story.
Yeah, right there. It's not that difficult, but I've encountered, there's a lot of people that are resistant to learn it, that sort of take the perspective that we know about universal chi. The way that we understand energy is this big universal thing. I've encountered that on numerous occasions, and I think it's really short-sighted to think that way, because the traditional theories only go so far, and we can't deny that there are structural issues that play out that can be related to any number of things.
This episode is brought to you by Jane, the clinic management software that honestly just makes running a practice easier. Let's dive into something that's never easy, but sometimes necessary: raising your fees. It can feel awkward, right? But here's a tip that can really help. Consider offering flexibility to your patients as you introduce the change. When patients face new fees, it's natural for them to feel uncertain or concerned. That's where flexibility can really make a difference. Offering options like a phased increase, suggesting a payment plan, or even taking a moment to talk things through can help to ease the transition. These thoughtful gestures show your patients that you're listening and care about them, which strengthens the trust you've worked so hard to build. If you're looking for more ideas on how to navigate these kinds of changes, head to frontdesk.jane.app and check out the article, How to Tell Clients You're Raising Your Fees. One last thing, if you're ready to give Jane a try, you can use the code CHIOLOGICAL for a 1-month grace period on your new Jane account. This makes me think about, and I can't remember which chapter it is, and I can't even remember which book it is. I don't know if it's the Neijing or the Nanjing. It's one of them, where we talk about the different levels, the book talks about the different levels of doctor. There's a doctor who treats at the level of spirit, and the doctor who treats at the level of, I can't remember the second one, but you get down to the bottom and it's like the carpenter who's working with the structure. It's considered the lowest level of doctor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Right.
And right?
Yeah.
Which I think is me, because there's something fascinating to me about how whatever universal thing is going on is manifesting in a person at a particular moment, in my presence. Can I be attentive to that? Can I work with whatever it is that they brought in? When it's in your body, it's a very intimate experience.
Mm. Yeah.
Right? I mean, that whole universal idea, transpersonal, whatever. I don't even know how to talk about universal chi, because it's just not where I live. I think there's something very dynamic and personal and intimate about working with the physiology.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. I've been really fortunate to work with some therapists and to learn and to utilize practices for helping people emotionally and psychologically through the body. And as you were just describing that from the Neijing, or one of the books, where there's those different levels of treating the spirit, I think a lot of us aspire to that. And it's kind of built into our theory that if we understand chi and the meridians and the traditional way that we speak of it, that somehow we have this command of spiritual energy. right? And being able to work with the shin and these things. And I think that's a beautiful thing. But yet, like, there is a really profound thing that happens when you start putting your hands on people with needles, just putting in a few needles, as few as 3 to 6, and then palpating, starting there, and then putting your hands on people. And I can think of it in a structural way, if there's an external rotation in their foot, and I think that may be going up the myofascial chains and causing problems in their neck and their head. Like, whatever is going on that physical level, there's still the mental and emotional experience that they have that's connected to their symptoms. And so even though I may emphasize like a very physical and even structural or myofascial approach, that doesn't discard the spirit of a person that's there before me. And in fact, I think that understanding the physical and the earth, it gives us insights into understanding the mind and the emotions even more, because the emotions will so often get held in the body in various ways. And
For sure, people talk about it all the time.
yeah, absolutely.
Some people hold it in their shoulder, some hold it in their belly, some hold it in their head.
Yeah. Yeah. They can hold it anywhere. I'm continuously surprised at the way that they hold it and the way that it overlaps with our traditional theories. I tend to like to think of like 5 major areas where people hold it: in their head, in their neck, in their jaw. We can throw that in there too, in their chest.
Oh boy, yeah, the jaws.
The jaw's a big one. In their chest, in their abdomen, in their hips and pelvis. So there's like these key areas, but many times I've been working on people and I'll have done my initial needles, 3 to 6 needles, and then I go over to a limb where I'm not going to put needles in too soon, and I just start palpating, and then something's released, like an emotional reaction or response occurs just from pressing on the lung meridian. And I like the approach of like starting with the physical and then moving up from there, depending on who you're working with and whatever arises once you start putting needles in.
I think there's something, again, maybe just because I'm that lower level doctor, or maybe because when it comes to universal things, I get very cautious, because it's just, at least for me, easy to become very disembodied and feet off the ground and become very heady about the whole thing. There's something about connecting with a person with my physiology and their physiology. When you put your hands on people, that's, humans have been doing this for a long time. And there's something about our sensory system. The folks that I've studied with who are very good with hands-on treatment, I think every single one of them has said, when you're working with your hands, you have to be in that experience of working with your hands. You can't think about what you're doing and do it at the same time. You can only be in the experience of doing it. Later, you can come back and look at it and go, oh yeah, well, that was actually the Chongmai that I was working with, and that's connected to blah, 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 blah. You can make a story about it. You can bring up a theory. You can craft a diagnosis.
Yeah.
But being in that connected moment of working with a person's physiology, again, I come back to the word intimate, and I don't mean sexual here. I mean intimate as there's something with the meat suit that's going on that brought them in your door.
Mm-hmm.
And that's worth attending to. It's not worth skipping over.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah.
And I'm going to interrupt for just a second, because you use the words, and I want to get into this a little. You use the words doors of perception.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to know more about doors of perception when you have your hands on people.
Well, we're not just using our eyes or our mouth or our other sensory organs at that time. We're establishing a very deep connection that lets that person know that we're present. And there's some sort of transference of energy or chi that occurs in that way when you start laying your hands on people. And I think that's really often overlooked, even by acupuncturists. And even, unless you're doing it on a regular basis, as an acupuncturist, there was a time I've always been interested in that. And I spent a lot of time with Tweena and learning massage and different things. And because I recognized that early, that putting your hands on people is a really therapeutic thing in a number of different ways. And yet, when I had my practices in the States, there was times when I was very busy and I had a high patient load. I had 2 clinics. I had acupuncturists working for me. And at that time, when you have a really high patient load, like, you don't necessarily have the time to put your hands on people. It depends on how you work, of course. Like, chiropractors will do it very quick, but a lot of the acupuncturists that I meet that use their hands, they like to be more slow and deliberate and present, not just doing rapid fire hands-on techniques. So running a practice with a high patient load, it really demanded that I just focus on the needles, which I was happy to do with an acupuncturist, because I do go through phases where I don't want to put my hands on people, because I know where that can go in terms of like emotional releases, and I don't always want to be practicing that way. And there's times where I just want to focus on the needles. And so I tend to go back and forth depending on what's going on in my life at the time, depending on how many clients I'm seeing at the time. And one thing that really helped me to get good at the Tung system was just going with small groups of points and quickly, not putting my hands on people, and seeing a lot of people really fast. Like, that'll get you good at the craft, and
So you get a lot of data points.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to go back to, because you asked a question. There was something you said I wanted to return to, and I felt like I was getting away from that.
I'm sorry, say that again. I didn't hear it.
There was something that you said that I wanted to return back to. We were talking about putting our hands on people, and
yeah, that there's this is just kind of like a treatment. It's easy to get a little bit confused, or a little bit, how do I phrase it? Like when you're following something, if you have an idea of what you want to do, you can just go after it.
Yeah.
But if you're not sure what you want to do, you're kind of following to see, what does this person need?
Mm-hmm.
And I find for myself, when I'm attempting to pay attention to the body and see what the body wants, sometimes it has a different story than what the person is telling me brought them in.
Yeah.
They're going, oh, it's my back. My back's the problem.
Right.
And, it turns out, like you were saying, maybe there's an issue with how their leg is rotated. It's not their back, it's their leg.
Yeah.
All right. So on one hand, listening to what the patient has to say, it's important. They want help with that. We can't lose track of it. But it also might not be the place where we need to put the majority of our attention. We need to see what else is connected to it, which is why I'm so interested in the idea of fascial planes. Because as we've been talking about, and I think any acupuncturist knows if they've looked at anatomy a little bit, and good gosh, we learned this in kindergarten, right? Toe bone connected to the foot bone connected to the ankle bone connected to the leg bone. It's a child's song, but it's true.
Yeah.
It's true. So, yeah, I think what I'm fishing for here, James, is a little help for in clinic. How can I first know which connections to attend to, which tissues to attend to, and then follow them through to something that's helpful for my patient?
Yeah, good question. One thing I want to speak about to begin this is it's really important to stay patient-centered. And I think with our traditional theories and the way that we think about things as acupuncturists, that we can sometimes get away from being patient-centered and patient-focused. And they may come in with back pain, but like you were saying, maybe there's something underlying that. Maybe it's an emotional situation. Maybe it is that they have an external rotation in their femur, and that's the primary causative factor behind it. But one thing that I like to do to understand these things as part of the system, and you've probably heard me say this before if you've watched anything, and I think this can be easily overlooked too, but it's something that's really important for staying patient focused, is asking the client about their top 3 health concerns and keeping that in the forefront at all times, every time they come in, because they may have something that they don't want to disclose or they don't want to share, or that, maybe they have shame around it, or maybe they're just not comfortable talking about something. And that may, in some ways, be a priority for them, but they may list that as their number 3 concern.
Or maybe they don't say it yet.
Yeah.
Because they need to first see if you're trustworthy before they're going to go there.
Yeah, absolutely. We got to build trust and rapport with people.
But that's interesting. Maybe number 3 is actually number 1.
I see it quite common. When you get them out of pain, like, they may come in for like physical pain is often the case. But then we can often get rid of that quite quickly. But then there's other things under the surface, right? And if you develop the ability to speak with them about that and have good communication skills about those things in a way that stays patient focused and patient centered, then that's a way that you start to build that trust and they'll start to disclose more. So I just recommend that. There's just so many things that can come from that. Because a lot of times too, what'll happen is maybe they're coming in for headaches or any common condition that you see. And let's say that it's something that responds quite quickly and well with acupuncture. So you get them out of pain, they see improvement, but then their third concern, maybe it's something like depression or anxiety or whatever it may be, right? Which is, it's more difficult to treat. There's more factors to consider, and just doing 3 needles, it's not going to resolve the depression for them. It may give them some relief and some benefit, but because the Shen disturbance patterns are multifaceted, then there's the need to work with people in different ways, because there's only really so much that the needles can do too. Like the needles aren't going to solve a lot of their psychological problems. It may release the emotions that are held in the body. And we have to be prepared for this too, because this is something that frequently happens, right? We put needles in people and then the person has an emotional release, and having those communication skills to be able to work through that with them and to be present with them is really essential.
Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about that. I think there's often a misconception that if something emotional gets released, then that's a good thing. That's healing, it's clearing. I don't think that's necessarily the case. It's like when people come in and they say things like, well, I'm doing a detox.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Oh, my chiropractor's got me doing a detox, or my functional medicine, whatever. They're doing it. Or I heard something on Chinese medicine, I'm doing a detox. And I always think to myself, what are you detoxing? From where? But more importantly, how do you get it out of the system in a way that it doesn't cause more trouble or get lodged somewhere else, right? And I think with emotions as well, just because they have a release doesn't mean that they're going to get better, especially if part of the, I'm using air quotes here, problem that they have sort of gives them a place to keep that emotion or store it. And now that's been taken away, it could cause more problems than solutions, I think.
Yeah, it can open up a can of worms.
I've seen this on occasion. People get more dysregulated.
Yeah, it can do that. Like a counselor friend of mine, I was using that term emotional release in some conversations that we were having. And then she also started speaking about emotional openings. Like it may not actually be a release where they have this emotional experience and it feels cathartic. And then, when we say that term release, it's kind of loaded with this idea that maybe we've released it and let it go. But that's often not the case. That may just be the initial opening of them becoming aware of the way that they've stored that emotion in their body, or the way that they're holding an emotion or a memory or a trauma in their body. And that takes a whole other set of skills to work with people at that level. And I think that relying on our traditional theories of, this is just a liver fire pattern, or this is spleen damp depression pattern, or whatever it may be, it doesn't give the client enough to work with. It's a whole different language. And if we are communicating to them with those traditional Chinese medicine terms about what's going on in emotional release, it doesn't give them enough to work with. And so it's not necessarily going to be a therapeutic thing unless you have the appropriate skills to deal with that. Does that make sense?
It does. It brings up a couple questions. One, is this something that's even in our ballywhack, or is this something that's like, hey, here's a referral to a psychotherapist? Or are there aspects of this that are within our ballywhack? I mean, we do talk about treating the spirit.
Yeah.
And that's it's part of our ancient literature.
Mm-hmm.
And we have this really amazing perspective that I think is very useful, that the different organ systems have a kind of personality or character. Maybe a better phrase is emotional resources.
Yeah.
And we can definitely work with that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm continuously surprised by the way in which needles will put people through therapeutic processes. The way I look at this now is that emotions get held in the body, and it's not necessarily confined to the ways that we may think of it in traditional terms, where anger's in the liver. And sure, there's these patterns. The Zongfu patterns are brilliant for what they are, and yet when we're working with people who are going through emotional processes, I want to circle back to what we were saying about working with our hands and putting our hands on people, because that is really a fundamental form of a somatic therapy. And I think it's something that is accessible to us. And if we learn to palpate these lines and we get good at certain methods of just putting our hands on people and palpating the meridians, then just by putting our hands on people, we're letting them know that we're there and we're present for them. And then there's other skill sets that we can stack on top of that.
James, how much do we need to, how do I phrase this? Like emotionally connect with our patients? Because sometimes that can just become a whole kettle of fish. And how much do we maybe not necessarily get into the whole emotional realm, but because we're attentive physically, they can kind of do that work without us trying to play psychotherapist. And the reason I ask this is, and I think all of us have had the experience, you were just talking about it too. Sometimes some needles can take them through a psychotherapeutic process without doing psychotherapy. People sometimes come out connected to resources that they didn't realize that they had, but it's been latent within them.
Right.
And one of the magical things about acupuncture is sometimes people will reconnect with parts of themselves that way and come out very, very different.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't think we need to play the role of psychotherapists, and we need to be respectful of our skills and the scope of practice laws that we have. And part of the reason this came up is because we were talking about putting our hands on people. And I found that when you do that, if you don't want to, there's been times, like I said, I don't want to work with people in that way with Shen disturbance or go into what's going on psychologically. Like there's times where I just don't want to do that. And in times like that, I just tend to put needles in people and not palpate so much and not start putting my hands on people. There's certain processes that I avoid because I know that they're more likely to produce emotional releases or responses in people. So, but if you're going to start, but we can just think in terms of palpating the meridians as a very mechanical thing though too. But the more you start putting your hands on people, then there's an increased likelihood of emotional things arising for people. So, if you're inclined that you don't want to go there, then just put needles in people and, you can keep it at that level too.
Having a thriving, profitable practice is one of the most healing things you can do as a healthcare practitioner, because a robust business is the ultimate expression of vital chi, and that's the heart of our medicine. I'm Julie Bairdontlock, and I help practitioners grow nourishing, profitable, authentic businesses that embody the generative cycle of Chinese medicine. This isn't about all yang all the time. It's about expanding your own internal capacity, growing collaborative relationships with your patients for ethical patient retention, and marketing as an extension of this medicine, not a necessary evil. You already know that everything is connected in your patients' lives and bodies. The same is true for your business. When we align your systems, your schedule, your pricing, and your offerings with you, we create flow, which means more spaciousness, more impact, and more joy. When you are in the flow, fully resourced in terms of chi, time, and money, your business becomes a source of healing, not just for your patients, but for you. Let's grow something rooted, radiant, and real. Visit lifeflowconsulting.com to learn more.
So the fascia, I want to come back to the fascia again.
Yeah.
It's often considered to be part of the triple burner.
Okay.
Have you been exposed to that idea, or do you think about that much?
No, I haven't. Who's teaching that?
Oh, okay. So in terms of teachers that suggested that, I can't tell you anyone in particular. It just seems it's been part of conversations that I've been party to over the years that the fascia is this material that's in between things, right? It wraps the organs, it connects things together. It's more a connective function than a thing itself.
Yes.
And the triple burners talked about it as this thing that's having a function but no form, which just about blew me out of acupuncture school in the beginning because I'm like, what the hell are you guys talking about? This is crazy.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think someone pointed out to me, it might have been one of my classmates actually, who was also a massage therapist, who said, yeah, this fascia, it like by itself, it's nothing, but there's tremendous amount of communication that goes through it in terms of fluids and piezoelectric energy and all kinds of stuff. So there's the other organ, the pericardium, that also is has a function but not a form and is often associated with consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So I sometimes wonder about these two things, the triple burner and the pericardium, as having some kind of connection with our emotive or conscious capabilities as a human being.
Yeah, in terms of like the Sanjiao being related to the fascia, I can understand the equivalency that you're making. And for me, that gets very conceptual though too. And I want to consider like, what's the clinical application of that? Like, what's the value in making that equivalency? And how does equating the Sanjiao with the fascia lead to me making a more accurate diagnosis or having better clinical outcomes? And I think a lot of times it's easy when we start to conceptualize these things. I find it extremely fascinating, and I do it myself all the time. However, like I do like to stay grounded in what is clinically applicable and valuable to my clients rather than get too heady about it,
Mm-hmm.
which I myself have that tendency. Like it's really been a discipline of mine to like stay out of my head and stay out of the concepts and ground this down into practical value. And so I'm coming from that perspective. And when I'm looking at the fascia now, like I'm not so interested in what's going on biochemically a lot of times, like although that topic is fascinating and that's something that I suspect I'll go into at some later phase because I do want to understand like what's going on the minute regions as well. And with the biochemistry, I think there's answers there and we can find things there that will have clinical value. But when I think about the fascia now, yes, we do understand that it connects all structures. And in terms of connecting the fascia back to some of the traditional theories, is we do have this idea of internal external relationships and the way that the meridians are an external phenomena that relate to the internal structures being the organs, right? So there's the internal external connections between the yin yang meridians, like the lung and large intestine and the pericardium and Sanjiao, right? But then there's the anatomy of this as well. And when we start to look at the connective tissues and the way that the fascia connects these organ systems, it starts to line up with a lot of those traditional theories. So, for instance, that lung-liver relationship that exists, this isn't an internal-external connection, but in the balance method, it's the system 5 connection, right? Based on the Harari cycle, where we have the beginning of the meridian cycle beginning with the lungs, and then the end is the liver. So there's that relationship between the liver and the lungs. Well, if you look at it anatomically, we do find that there are fascial connections and ligaments that connect the liver to the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is the primary part of the respiratory system. And then there's connections from the lungs to the diaphragm. So there's fascial and connective tissue relationships that exist from the liver to the diaphragm to the lungs. And I think there's a lot of value in making these connections and understanding that there is connective tissue anatomy that supports these traditional meridian system connections. And those system connections are not just limited to the internal external relationships between the lung and the large intestine and the stomach and the spleen, but the 5 system connections, or the 6 systems that we speak of in the balance method and in the Tung style. And I have a whole class on that, on internal medicine, that dives into those fascial and connective tissue connections that provides an anatomical basis for those systems.
This is really cool. I remember in acupuncture school, we learn about these internal branches of the channel. So, for example, the lung channel, it begins at Ren 12, right? It begins with the stomach mu point, right? Which is curious, right? And then there's all these different, like there's divergent pathways, and then there's certain, they say, it's a pathway that dives deep into the body, right? There's the law channels, but there's also just, these other portions to a channel. If you read the books, they're in there. And I was always confused by that. Like, well, how am I supposed to remember all of that?
Right.
It's enough just to remember what's on, the surface of the lung channel, for example. Think about all those internal connections. And as we're having this conversation in this moment, thinking about that overlay of looking at the various fascial structures and how they relate to each other. And then you put the points on it. When I was a kid, we didn't have the internet. We had encyclopedia sets. And one of my favorite things in the encyclopedia was the human body with the transparent plates, where you'd have like the bones, and then you put the transparent plate on, and now you see the blood vessels, and now you put the muscles on, and now you put the organs on, right?
Right.
And so I've got this transparent plate in my head going right now. Oh, different fascial connections and different points of influence.
Yeah. Well, that's a really fascinating study, and that's something that I've documented as well, is the meeting points. So a lot of these meeting points that exist, and I can't remember them either, like conceptually, I forget a lot of them as well. And I don't think we need that, because if you're just trying to memorize the meeting points, it's all just really conceptual. But when you start to understand the anatomy and look at the way that these meeting points correspond to areas where muscles meet and where muscles cross over, and you understand the anatomy of insertions or attachments or different anatomical things that are happening, then it starts to make sense why these meeting points exist in the traditional ways that they do. But if you're only coming at it from a traditional perspective and you just memorize that the bladder and the small intestine channel meet at this obscure point on the back somewhere they meet, or some of these meeting points might have 3 or 4 meridians connecting to them. I'm having a hard time finding an exact one to speak of here, but the primary point is, if you take the time to explore those meeting points and some of the things that you mentioned, and you look at the anatomy behind it, and you look at the different levels of the anatomy, from the superficial muscles to the deep muscles, and the way that the fascial lines will cross over and where they meet, the Tai Yang channels, for instance, I think it's just so incredibly fascinating that deep back arm line that looks like the small intestine meridian and includes the levator scapulae muscle, it attaches up into the upper cervicals, and then you've got that superficial back line, or the bladder line, coming down through the suboccipitals, and then the paraspinals, and the deep muscles in the neck are on that superficial back line. And so we can find that the Tai Yang meridians, they join anatomically in one area. They join anatomically in a number of areas, but they converge at the levator scapulae's connection to the upper cervical vertebrae in C2 and C3. And then if you come down, the rhomboids between the scapula and the spine are on that deep back arm line, which is equivalent to the small intestine meridian. But those are also connecting to those thoracic vertebrae. And then you've got the paraspinals and the erector spinae in there. That's the UB line, that's on the UB line. And so many, there's so many of these traditional theories can be better understood through just knowing the anatomy and getting good at anatomy.
And it sounds like those various meeting points are kind of like an X on a pirate treasure map.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where a lot of the magic happens. You can probably see that I was kind of struggling to name some of those meeting points and where the meridians line up. But if I just speak in terms of like where the muscles connect and where they join, and that's the terminology I'm most familiar with now. And that's where a lot of the magic does happen. And that's where we can understand why, these points like small intestine 3 and 22.09 tongue system, we can understand why these not only treat the neck, but why they can treat other areas as well, in the whole spine and the back of the knee and the whole Tai Yang, foot Yang, urinary bladder meridian.
Yeah. For me, I find it very satisfying to have a physical substrate that connects the dots, so to speak.
Yeah.
Because when I think in terms of like chi or energy or, well, this is connected to that, and I've got this nice imaginal system of how it works, that's not helpful for me.
Yeah, it's really not. It's limited.
I mean, it's a nice idea, but I find it's not that useful in clinic. And beyond that, there's a part of me, again, I'm that like carpenter level practitioner. I want to understand what's happening within the structures of the body.
Yeah.
Because that's where the action is happening.
Absolutely. Yeah. What else is there? Yeah.
So what about some of these big, heavy-hitting dong points that often get used? So like what is it? The 4 horses, 3 horses?
Yeah.
I'm not a dong person. I've only studied it a little bit, but there's a number of points that seem to get a lot of attention. Or like here's an interesting one. What about Fu Ke? Right. Those points that are supposed to be so good for the ovaries, and then the thumb.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of that relates to the neurology, because like these hand points, we need to understand that they produce a really strong neurological reaction, because of the nerve endings and the somatotropic map in the brain, right? Like the area of the sensory and motor cortex that's related to the hands, it occupies a big area, right? So whenever we needle the points, like the most sensitive ones on the hands or the fingers, they produce a really strong neurological response. So I think what's happening there is the signals, if we want to speak of this in Western terms, and I think what's happening there is producing a strong enough physiological, neurological reaction that it's able to reach the hormonal system. And it's working on pain gate mechanisms, and it's working in a variety of ways. But I think that we'll find that hormonally there's some changes that are occurring via the endocrine system. And that's in part due because of the strength of the sensory reactions that are occurring from needling points around the thumb. And it's not just the Fu Ke points, right? But we use Li4 for similar conditions. Ling Gu can be used for similar conditions. And, I suspect that you could use any number of points around the thumb and get a similar response. And sometimes I do tests like this in a group setting where rather than needle the Fu Ke points, what happens if we do like some other points around the thumb? And
see what happens.
Yeah. And looking at this anatomically, we're still stimulating the same nerves and the same myofascial lines. So I think that it would be really valuable to set up some research along this line too, where points are compared not based on what meridian and not based on traditional methods, but based more on what myofascial lines and what nerves are being stimulated through these. And we need to look at both of those together. And I found
That's a really fascinating idea. That could be a great project for a doctoral student.
Yeah, I'd love to do that project.
Yeah.
Because, yeah.
So that makes sense to me, that as we get out to the fingers and the toes, lots of nerve endings, like you said, that homunculus in our head has a lot of tissue that goes to, tongue, fingers, toes. And so we have this neuroendocrine interaction that happens, out of that, because it's really affecting the neurology. That's, we're talking earlier about mechanical energy, bioelectric energy, hormonal energy, different kinds of ways of powering the system. I hadn't thought about Foucault working that way. That makes sense. What about others that, like you were just talking on the small intestine channel, like small intestine 3, how it affects the neck? It sounds like this is less about neuroendocrine interactions and more about that tissues are connected to other tissues. You're affecting it in one space, it affects it in the other.
Yeah.
Do I have that right, or is there another way to think about it?
One thing I like to, if we're thinking in terms of energy and in terms of electrical energy or neurological energy, I like to think of it in 3 ways. It makes it really simple. There's the mechanical energy that relates to the myofascia and movement. And then there's the electrical energy in the nervous system. And then there's biochemical energy. And I would classify, they're all interrelated, right? So they're all mutually dependent on each other, and muscle contraction and movement depends on neurological energy as well, right? So when I think about points now, if someone has a neurological problem and they've been diagnosed with that, and I want to produce a strong neurological response, then I'm going to needle points on the hands and the feet because I know that they are going to produce the most bang for the buck. Okay, but if someone has a musculoskeletal condition, then I'm going to want to needle the ones that are going to affect the myofascial system more. And the points that are in the IT band on the gallbladder line, right? Like Thionine Miles 3, GB31, those points are like big points in the tongue system. And we've got a really dense area of fascia there. And this relates to the traditional teachings of if you want to affect the bone, needle the bone. If you want to affect the tendons, needle the tendon. If you want to affect the muscles, needle the muscles. So it's kind of like that way of thinking, but I'm thinking more in terms of what points are going to work on the nervous system and which ones are going to affect the myofascial system more. And taking this back to what we were saying, like external rotation in the leg is a very common pattern that you can see in clinic every day on multiple patients. And there's external rotation. So the deep hip rotators are going to be in chronic contraction, and you're going to get contraction in like the glutes, and you'll get contraction along the gallbladder line. And when there's chronic contraction there, you can put a needle in an area of chronic contraction and release it like they do with dry needling or needling into trigger points. You've got an area of contraction, you needle into it to get the release to occur that way, right? However, like those points are also recognized as being very strong for the nervous system and are used for strokes and hemiplegia and facial conditions like Bell's palsy, where the nerves are involved. So some of these points will work with very powerfully on both systems. They'll work on the mechanical energy, myofascial system, and then they work on the nervous system. And just kind of conceptualizing points in that way, like, is this point working more on the nervous system to produce a neurological response, or is this group of points over here working more through the musculoskeletal system and the myofascial lines? That can be a really good way to think about things.
Yeah. James, I think you have just illuminated for me this thing we were talking about earlier about the different levels of doctor.
Mm-hmm.
We actually need to be all those levels of doctor.
Yeah.
Because our patients come in, they've got something going on. Our job is to see where do they need that help. Do they need it at the, I'm going to use some Western terms here, neurological level? Do they need it at a more endocrine level? Do they need it at a more physical mechanical level?
Mm-hmm.
And we have different points that will address each of those.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're overlapping, sometimes they're not. But that seems like a really helpful way of just doing like an initial screening of like, where's the problem and where do I need to focus? What kind of doctor do I need to be for this patient? Maybe is the question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And what you just said too, it reminded me of something I wanted to say with palpation and speaking in terms of the points that are between the metacarpals and the metatarsals. So the points on the hands and feet, but those ones that are specifically between the metacarpals and the metatarsals. So on the feet, we have liver 3 and liver 2, and in the tongue system, they'll pair them up and use them together, but they move liver 3 proximal a bit. And then you've got points that are on the stomach meridian, like stomach 42 or 66.05, which is at the junction of the second and third metatarsals. And then you've got like GB41 and GB42 can be a really powerful set. So if you're new to the tongue system, like recognizing to use 2 points in close proximity together is a really important technique because you're getting a synergistic response. So, but these points here, like you can build a whole practice just on needling hand points and points in the feet because they're so powerful. And we're needling into muscles, right? But these points produce a strong Daichi response. So we're getting that neurological, electrical energy response as well. So these can be some of the best points for getting both a neurological and myofascial response. And that's an interesting thing to do. There have been times in my practice, and I like to do things like this in a group setting where you're seeing people more quickly and doing fewer needles, where I'll just say, okay, with this group session, I'm only going to do like hand points. I'm going to limit myself. Whatever comes in, whoever comes in, whatever they have, I'm just going to rely on hand points, or I'm just going to rely on foot points. And I did that for a lot of years, and that really helped.
What a great way to train yourself.
Yeah, it was.
What a great way to get a lot of information quickly.
Yeah.
About a particular set of points or a particular method.
And to learn the strengths and limitations of those points too.
For sure. Yeah, I like that. I could see having a little fishbowl in my clinic. Today is, and I just reach in and pull out like, what is a day?
Yeah, try that.
I could try that. It's interesting. I like the idea of a group setting for that too, because, then you're focused in on things. And I don't know about you or the listeners. I find when I'm really busy, it's better for my focus because if I've got extra time, my attention tends to wander. But if I don't have extra time, I'm much more focused and in many ways much more clear-minded.
Yeah, right.
Because I'm not letting my mind wander.
Completely. I agree. I remember an old song about that too. Too much time on my hands. I just came up with that sticks.
Yeah, great. Wow. Well, I can't believe we've been yakking for over an hour here. The time really flies by when you're having fun.
Yeah, definitely. Gosh, I feel like I've only just begun.
I know. It's like maybe we should pull out whiskey and cigars and go for another 2 hours, Joe Rogan style.
Well, it's evening here where I'm at. So.
I got to get ready to go to work, though.
Yeah.
As a way of winding it down, though, anything you'd like to share with folks about just considering, anything else you want to say about considering the fascia or Tung style and the stuff that you're teaching?
Final closing comments, huh? Well, I would say that one thing I really enjoy about the Tung system is that it's actually very easy to use once you get an understanding that it really just relates to the myofascia and the anatomy. And once you understand the way that they number the points, which is really very brilliant.
How's that brilliant?
And I really...
How's the point numbering brilliant? Because I find it confusing.
Well, yeah, and everyone does. I did it first too. It took me years to see the brilliance of it because it's classifying the points in a whole different way. Rather than along meridian lines, it's classifying them in body segments, right? So you've got finger points, you've got hand points, you've got lower arm points, and these finger points will produce a strong neurological response, but you can also access the bone. So some of those points are indicated for bone-related conditions.
Because it's so easy to get to the bone.
Yeah, exactly. And this is something that the Western researchers have validated as well, is that if you peck the bone, if you do bone pecking and just stimulate it, that it does produce a response in the skeletal system. And researchers have found that that's the case. So, again, that relates to our traditional theory. So these points, if you want to have a neurological or a bone response, the finger points are great. If you want to have a neurological myofascial response, the hand points or the foot points. If you want to have a response more through the muscles and less on the nerves, then use points on the arms. And as you come up higher, you're getting into more muscle. The Daichi sensation tends to be less intense, so it's not going to produce that really strong Daichi reaction in people, but you'll still get a strong myofascial response. And another thing about it too is that you'll find that, like, I could just go on about this for so long, but a lot of in the tongue system, a lot of the internal conditions are treated with the more proximal points. So like the four horses are known for respiratory conditions. They're more proximal. They're on the thighs, right? The upper legs. And then same with 88.01 through 88.03 and 88.04 for heart conditions. Those are on the thigh as well. And then you got the kidney points that are like spleen 10 and up from there. And then you've got a lot of points here on the arms that are also used for internal conditions. And I think that this relates to spinal loops and autonomic responses. So the organs are regulated through the autonomic nervous system. So when you start to learn to think in terms of the segments of points as numbered in the tongue system and then equate that to a Western perspective, it just makes sense as to why they work the way they do. And that's what I've outlined in my classes and on my website. And you can find more at Integrative Healing Society. I put out a ton of free information about this on my YouTube and on my website and blog. So check that out.
Great. I'll make sure all that's on the show notes page so people can just go directly to it. I thank you. I appreciate this. I get it that the tongue system's numbering, it's just a different Dewey Decimal System.
Yeah.
For organizing information. But the way that you've just described it makes a lot of sense to me. So I'm going to go back and take a look at some of that stuff again. And I think I'll have a new perception and maybe be able to make better use of it.
Yeah, just one quick thing I'd say about that too, where it got a lot easier for me, rather than thinking of these points as being in weird locations, just think of how the points are on the meridians. So if you learn the points, just think of what meridian is this on? And yeah, it might be 0.5 sun lateral to the stomach meridian or whatever, but don't let that upset you. If you think of it in terms of myofascial lines and you equate it to that, then it just makes so much easier.
Great. All right. I look forward to trying it out in clinic.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, please do.
Okay. Well, James, thank you so much for your time today. This has really been a delight, and we may have to come back and chew the fat some more about this after I get a little more experience.
Okay. Great.
All right.
Well, thanks, Michael. I appreciate it. Have a great day.
Well, that's it today for our conversation with James. I'm left thinking about what other connections and possibilities for treatment arise when we take into consideration the function and the character of the fascia. James has a way of blending traditional insight with anatomical precision, showing how structure, movement, and neurology all play into the effects of our treatments. I particularly resonate with how fascia provides a tangible framework for understanding the acupuncture channels. Instead of thinking in abstract terms, looking at the body's connective tissue offers a clear, mechanical explanation for why certain points do what they do. His insights into why Tung acupuncture works so well, especially with fewer needles, it reminds me that I've at times used too many needles in chasing results that only receded further and further away as I stumbled into the mistake of overtreating my patients. I also appreciated his take on structural alignment and its role in chronic pain. Sometimes the key to unlocking persistent issues isn't about adding more needles, but more about understanding the fascial patterns that hold the tension in place. This conversation, it reminds me that acupuncture is more than point selection. It's seeing how everything connects. Well, here we are at the end of this episode. If you've listened up to this point, you're either a rabid fan of Qiological or the forward button on your podcast player stopped working. If you are indeed a fan of the podcast, you can help us to bring new episodes to our community of practitioners by supporting us with a membership or a one-time contribution. Details, of course, are on the website. That's it for today, friends. Join us again next Tuesday for another thoughtful episode of Qiological.